was one day breakfast and Mom was making pancakes. And Kevin and Ryan were just sitting there at the table waiting for the pancakes, and they began to argue about who was going to get the first pancake. And the arguments got louder and louder and louder, and finally Mom came in and thought, well, here we have an opportunity for a lesson. What would Jesus do in this situation? He asked the kids, do you know what Jesus would do? Jesus would say, let my brother have the first pancake. You know that's what Jesus would do. And Kevin and Ryan looked at each other, and Kevin looked at Ryan and said, you be Jesus. Clearly, Kevin missed the point of the lesson, but I think Kevin is who I am like more often than not. In fact, I think we're all Kevins. We want someone else to step out and be the first. We can wait. We want somebody else to be like Jesus. We want to see it in practice. We want to see if it really works. And I wonder sometimes if the disciples thought the same way. Maybe they couldn't buy in because they weren't absolutely sure about this guy they decided to follow. The one thing we forget is there were lots of people claiming to be messiahs at the time. Jesus was not the only one wandering around the countryside with crowds of people behind him. Now, Jesus may have been the only one who was performing real miracles and not tricks, but still, the disciples had to have that in the back of their mind. Is Jesus truly who he says he is? There had to be some doubt. Maybe that's why they couldn't trust completely. And based on things they said, things that we read in the New Testament, it sounds like they did struggle a little bit with whether they totally bought in to the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. Trusting completely means you basically surrender. And surrender is a dirty word to most people, and yet we do it for our sports teams. We would do anything to see our teams win. We act like we don't care about a little cheating if it means that our team can win. We can put up with coaches who are horrible and nasty as long as they're our coaches, not somebody else's. We're all in when it comes to our sports teams. We can put up with a whole lot. We completely buy in if they're our sports team. But when I look at my spiritual walk, I wonder, am I all in for God? Do I totally surrender to God completely? In our scripture today, Jesus just found out that John the Baptist had been killed. Herod had put him to death. Trouble was brewing, and Jesus knew it. He knew that he could possibly be the next target. Many commentators believe the first words in the passage we're looking at today reflect a little bit of that worry in Matthew 14, verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, he heard the story about John dying. He withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Notice what Jesus did. It was obvious he was shaken by the events that he just heard and the death of John. So he withdrew. And where did he go? A solitary and desolate place. Some people believe it was because he wanted to be alone. Others believe it was because he wanted to get off the grid. He wanted to be off the radar where nobody would find him. The goal was not to be found because the heat clearly was on anybody who claimed to be a follower of Jesus. The other thing I find very interesting is that he chose to leave by boat. I imagine his goal was to leave the crowds behind, but it didn't work. Imagine Jesus on the boat with the disciples, and they're looking across the water as they're crossing, and they see these people just basically following them on shore, and the disciples, come on, row a little faster, we got to get moving. These people are following, and hi over there, and they're trying to get to shore as quick as they can or away from these people, and yet the crowds kept up with them. It was almost like, we'll see you there when you get wherever you're going. So when Jesus went ashore, guess what? The crowd was already there. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus saw the crowd, and he had compassion for them. His ministry continued as he healed the sick, and I would guess he probably continued his teaching. But the evening arrived, and where were they? A desolate place, a solitary place. No food, no McDonald's, no Pizza Hut. Or was there? Jesus set the disciples up for a lesson here. They were obviously close enough that the people could have walked to a village nearby and found food. So what happens? The disciples tell Jesus, send them away and tell them to go buy food for themselves. So they were close enough. They were, yes, far away, but they were close enough that they could have walked to get food. However, Jesus knew there was another food source present. He knew there was another way. The question in that moment was, could the disciples see the way? Did they really believe in the impossible? Did they really believe in Jesus? Remember, they just seen Jesus healing the sick. The passage says Jesus was healing the sick right there. They knew that Jesus was in the business of doing miracles. He was healing the sick, making people well. They saw him do this every single day. But did they really, truly believe? Jesus knew the people could walk to the village, but Jesus also knew that they had some food. So what did Jesus say? Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Says this to the disciples, you do it. You give them something to eat. Jesus acted like it was ridiculous to send the people away. Jesus basically issued them a challenge. He tested their faith. He wanted to know the depth of their faith. You give them something to eat. This account of the feeding of the multitudes is the only miracle account that we see presented in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In John, we hear details about the boy who provided the loaves and fish. In Mark, we hear about all the objections of the disciples raised when Jesus said, you give them something to eat. But Matthew boils it down to the essential point. The people are hungry. The village is far but close enough on foot. The disciples say, send them away. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. So how did the disciples respond? The disciples said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. We have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. To me, this verse says so much about how the disciples had built their worldview. In just these few words, we see how they view the power of Jesus. How is that possible? The word that sticks out to me in this verse is the word only. We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. We only have this little when we have all these people. To us today who know the end of the story, it seems almost ridiculous that the disciples couldn't figure out that Jesus might do the impossible. I believe that in the quiet times when he was with the disciples, Jesus taught them about times when the impossible happened. There were other situations in the Bible that Jesus told them about where there was no food and something miraculous took place. I imagine that one day Jesus was sitting with them and started telling the story from Exodus chapter 16. The Israelites were traveling through the desert to the promised land, but now they're hungry. So Jesus tells the story of Moses and Aaron and the Israelites from Exodus chapter 16. Now remember, to them at their time, the Bible was the Old Testament. That was the Bible. That was their scripture. That was their understanding. When they went around, Jesus spoke in the synagogues because he was a Jew. So therefore, he was going back to stories that they would have told in the synagogues over and over again. So, we have the story of Exodus chapter 16 verses 2 and 3. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. I imagine they said it with weeping and, oh, how dare you do this to us? You brought us out into the desert, and what did you do? You left us without food. We had it so much better in Egypt, where we had all the food we wanted. Yes, we were beaten every day by the Egyptians, but that's okay. We had food. I mean, it was like they totally forgot what it was like in Egypt. So Jesus tells the disciples this story. I imagine he says that to them at some point. Says, remember this story that we've talked about. What did God do for the Israelites? He provided quail for them to eat at night, and manna appeared on the ground each morning. And he did it for 40 years. God did the impossible. They were in the desert and they had food. He fed his people. He fed all of the Israelite people. The disciples had to have known this story. Of course they knew this story. Every synagogue repeated the story of God's protection of his people, and Jesus probably told the story as well. So when Jesus said to the disciples, "You give them something to eat," what was the right answer? I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't only. It wasn't to use the word only. Jesus wanted all. He wanted more. He wanted them to see beyond. Jesus doesn't understand the word only. Jesus understands the word all. Paul in his letter to the Corinthian church reminds us that Jesus paid the price for our sin with his death on the cross. Jesus is the perfect example of someone who sacrificed all. Not only a part, but all. So what does he want in return? Not only a part of our lives. He wants everything. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body, says Paul. When we choose only, we only give God Sundays. That's God's day. The rest of the week is mine to do with what I want. But when we say all, it means every day of the week. It means acting with integrity. It means remembering who we are at all times, that we're children of God. So instead of only, we say all. The disciples offered only 5 loaves and 2 fish, but Jesus wanted so much more. Part of the problem is that the disciples could see only what they had. They could touch the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Those were tangible. Those were real. Jesus wanted them to stretch beyond what they could touch to something bigger, something greater. But the lesson wasn't just about that moment. Not only, but all. Not only now, but forever. Jesus was checking to see if the disciples were in the moment or ready for forever. They watched Jesus every day. They saw the miracles. They saw the impossible become possible. And yet they traveled to this desolate place, and what did they see? They saw desolation. They didn't see anything else. They didn't see the possibilities. They only saw the moment. They didn't see forever. And Jesus wanted them to learn a lesson that would last. If we surrender to God's presence and yield our lives to Him, it will impact everything we do, from the past to the present to the future. It will change the way we think. It will change the way we live. It will change the way we treat our children. It will change our relationships. It will change how we work for our bosses. It will make us living examples of what it means to live out a life in God. And that day when we see the paycheck and wonder if it will stretch to the end of the month, instead of saying we have only this much, we give it to God and be prepared for what God will do. Why? Because we know God is not the God of only the past. He is not the God of only the Old Testament. And God is not the God of only this particular moment. God is the God of forever, past, present, and future. Not only all, not only now, forever, and not only practical, but impossible. I add this one in because I have a habit of boxing God into the practical. I want to make sure that whatever God does, it can fit in with my explanation. I've got to provide a scientific explanation for why the Red Sea parted at the time it did. I begin to take away from the impossible, making it possible. But God is a God of the impossible. When things have happened in my own life, for instance, I broke my arm in 6 places and 2 weeks later I was basically healed. I try to find all the reasons in my head as to why that is possible in my realm of understanding. I want to believe that I can find a way to explain it from a scientific perspective, even though the doctor I had couldn't explain it himself. And finally, I had to come to the conclusion, guess what? Had to be God. The disciples were thinking of the practical. They missed the impossible. The practical was, we'll send the people to the village. The impossible was, put it in Jesus' hands and see what happens. The practical was, well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fishes. There's no way we can feed all these people. The impossible was that Jesus saw so much more. And so the story continues. They said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The faith test for the disciples was to see as Jesus sees. Jesus wanted them to see the impossible, but they only saw the practical. They walked with Jesus. They talked with Jesus. They saw the impossible happen every day. But it's hard for us to make that jump. It's hard to trust. It's hard to surrender. It's hard to believe even when we see it with our own eyes, because again, we want to explain it in our humanness. And that's what faith is all about. It's removing the onlys from our lives. It's handing 5 loaves and 2 fish to God and saying, I can't wait to see what's going to happen. God is the God of the impossible. Not only all, not only now, forever, not only practical, but the impossible. As a DJ, I play the Hokey Pokey quite often. Way too often. We all know the song. You put your left arm in, you take your left arm out, and then you shake it all about. But at the end of the Hokey Pokey, the song tells us to do something. It doesn't give us a body part. It doesn't say put part of your body in and take part of your body out. What does it say? Put your whole self in. It reminds me of the words of the Apostle Paul in Romans 12:1 when he says, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies, your whole body, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Don't put in only your left arm. Don't put in only your right leg. Some of us are only willing to give God our backside. But God wants our whole self. Not only all, not only now, forever. Not only the practical, but the impossible.